The security situation in Nigeria has deteriorated since 2006, but experienced a particularly accelerated decline over the last 5 years. While the causes are manifold, illicit markets have been one key contributor to sharply escalating insecurity in Nigeria. This destabilizing role is widely recognized, and the way perpetrators continuously carry out illicit activities with a degree of consistency is in certain communities or states is not often discussed. Now, in funding insurgent groups, cattle rustlers, and of course arms traffickers, it erodes the well-intended good governance of states, pointing towards socio-economic sabotage, corruption, and sustained cycles of violence. From Paris in France, I'm being joined by Esteban Giudici, who is the Director of Programs at Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, Transit. Thank you so much, Esteban, for joining this conversation.
No, thank you. Good morning to you and to your audience. This is a problem that needs to be visualized in Nigeria, so we are very happy to be here with you.
All right, that's true. And I know that you and Tolu had discussions around this some times back, but then I'd like to understand, most especially for the purpose of our viewers that may have missed it, what is illicit trade? What are the various types of illicit trade, and why is it that it has festered so much in Africa over the last 2 decades?
Yes, well, to start with, I mean, there is no a comprehensive or a unique definition of illicit trade. We understand that illicit trade is everything that is commercialized in the gray economy, meaning that it's not following the rules that should be followed. I mean, there are many sectors of illicit trade. We can talk about products subject to excise, namely tobacco and alcohol. We can talk about products that are infringing intellectual property rights. That can be footwear, apparel, electronics. It can be illicit trade in pharmaceuticals, wildlife, agri-food. It can also be in luxury products. And what's the common thread? What's the common driver behind all these forms of illicit trade? There is always corruption. There is always illicit flows, financial flows, and there is always organized crime. Because to put forward this kind of operations, you need a real structure. And another very important factor behind all forms of illicit trades, it's the undermining of the objectives, the goals of every society. I'm talking here about having better economic prospects. I'm talking here about having help for the consumers, having resources to help the people who need it the most. Illicit trade undermines all these. And just to finish giving you some information about what is the implication of illicit trade in Africa, well, a recent study that was commissioned by the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations one, estimated that 50 million a year, 50 million US dollars a year are lost because of illicit financial flows. Of course, this is not only illicit trade, this includes every kind of flow of money that may leave the country without following the regulations. And this leads me to talk about the Financial Action Task Force. As you may be aware, very recently Nigeria was put in an in-case monitoring list, a gray list, because of this kind of problematics that includes illicit trade, and this severely undermines the economic prospects of Nigeria.
Okay, so Esteban, we know that countries like Nigeria, other African countries have regulatory bodies, government agencies that are meant to monitor and nip this kind of nefarious actions in the bud. And why is it that Nigeria has found itself in this position despite the activities of these agencies, as it were, and different programs by the government to tackle corruption? Is it that it is not doing enough? Is it that Nigeria has not been aggressive enough in tackling situations of illicit trade? Or is it that the sabotage is monumental and overwhelming for the government to deal with?
Well, I think that I can answer part of that question on why we created the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, Tracy. It's because it's a problem that needs to be visualized. It's not only a problem for Africa or for Nigeria. Illicit flows, it's a problem for all over the world. I mean, it's a problem in every region of the world we are grappling with, even in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, not to mention eastern of the world. I mean, it's a problem of the producing and commercializing stuff without following appropriate regulations. I already mentioned the implications. Now, yes, of course, a normal facilitator, a common facilitator for this is corruption. And there are glitches in every system, and of course, this also happens in Nigeria. Now you ask me why isn't the government being, let's say, aggressive enough? Well, we understand that there are many things that can be done. We don't want to shame and blame. We understand that there are other priorities in the country. Just to give a little bit of context, Nigeria, you just mentioned in the headlines that Nigeria regained its position as the leader producer of oil in Africa. This is a huge opportunity, but we need to take into consideration that there is illicit trade in these products too. We haven't conducted a study in Nigeria yet, but recently we were in South Africa, and through the Maputo corridor, there is evidence of illicit trade in oil. And these are profits that are being lost. Besides fueling organized crime, the problem is that we are losing money, the country, when it needs it the most. But well, let's take the case of Nigeria. The country GDP is growing on average 2.9%, if I'm not wrong. It's a little bit above the population growth, which is 2.4%. But another problem that Nigeria has is the huge inflation. It's 22% nowadays. And we have many reports that evidence that there is a direct correlation with illicit trade. It's the chicken and the egg. We don't know what starts first, probably both things at the same time, but more inflation necessarily turns out to be more illicit trade because the consumers have less purchase power, and this retroaliments the inflation. Now, what does the country need to do? Why there are many things that are happening that need to be tackled? Well, because illicit trade is a very complex phenomenon. It's not only the criminal aspects, it's also very important to tackle everything that has to do with economics. For instance, this is something that for us was really serious. There was an emergency tax in Nigeria related to the importation of beer in 2017. There are some problems with that right now. I mean, this was not discussed in depth. Probably the decision was not well informed. But the problem is that this creates a driver for illicit trade. And there is another problem with that it fuels criminal industries, even terrorism. There is evidence of financing of terrorism with tobacco, illicit tobacco, and illicit alcohol. The problem is that the country needs to address this in a holistic way, taking into consideration all relevant aspects. And for us, it's very important to manage to foster private-public cooperations. This is the way that we are going to have a real result, when all the stakeholders have a voice in the table and they can put forward adequate and informed policies. We have seen good experiences, and if you want, I can elaborate on a good experience that Nigeria had with the National Agency for Food and Drugs, the NAFDAC. It's very famous, even at the OECD in Paris, that was exposed a few years ago. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are many things that can be done, and we really hope that this is going to be the case for Nigeria, because we need to take action now. Otherwise, it's going to be too late, or it's going to be much more difficult in the future.
All right. And now that you've said that illicit trade is complex because it has a broad spectrum that cuts across different sectors of the economy, both the formal and the informal sector, as it were. But then in certain scenarios, citizens have come out to say that there's been a bit of government complicity in some areas, that in some areas the government has not empowered these so-called agencies and probably the local citizens to help deal with the issue of illicit trade within their locality. Now, how do you think that the government can absolve itself of these kind of allegations? And how do we facilitate a bit of synergy between the government and the citizenry to tackle issues of illicit trade?
Yes, okay, well, we are not aware of the reasons of why this happened, why the government took the action or not. We are aware of what's the situation and what needs to be done. I mean, as I mentioned before, there are glitches in every system. We trust in governments. We believe that they are there to make rule of law exist. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a rule of law. There wouldn't be a mechanism for taking care of all these things. But yes, we need to find, again, a common ground between consumers, society, and the government. And this is something that we try to do. I mean, Traceit is an NGO. My organization is an NGO. We are a voice of the industry, but we also represent the civil society. And what we are trying to do here is to convey these ideas to the government. We have recently done so in South Africa, and we have a really good reaction from the government. And we are creating awareness at all different levels. I mean, We need to understand we are coming out from a pandemic still. It seems that it was a long time ago, but it was really recent, and we are still suffering those problems, and many of them compounded the illicit trade problem because of many different reasons, including restrictions or emergency tax or problem or lack of enforcement in some sectors. But we believe that sometimes the governments have other priorities, or they don't understand that illicit trade should be taken as a priority. So I think that a way to champion this agenda, to improve this, is to convey the same message consistently to the society and also to the government. So we have a momentum and all relevant stakeholders, they're on the same page that the way to go is tackling this problem. I mean, it's something that is happening all over the world. Are we going to have a non-registered economy that destroys the middle class and prevents the more vulnerable sectors to receive help? Or are we going to fight that and we are going to try to make economy register because of all the problems that they create? And for this, clearly we need the government and the people.
All right, Esteban, we are talking about issues around round tripping, smuggling, counterfeiting, money laundering, terrorism, financing, and all that. And there have been speculations that there's been a bit of influence from international organizations, both overtly and covertly, who may have strong influences on African countries. Now, how do you now expect Africa to deal with this kind of foreign incursions or interventions, not even interventions, we call it foreign influence that actually enable this kind of illicit activities, because they seem to have a bit of stronger holds on Africa. So how can Africa break free from this stranglehold and try to put an end to illicit flows and trades around this corridor?
Yes, okay, yeah. I think that here there is an international body, as you mentioned, the Financial Action Task Force, that has recently grade-listed Nigeria because apparently there are some indicators that there are 40 recommendations from this organism that they are peer assessed. In Nigeria, it's done by a regional body that is called the HIAVA, and what they do is they assess the different indicators that the country has to fight money laundering, illicit financial flows, financing of terrorism. And this is addressed from two different perspectives, and it's related to the point that we were discussing before. I mean, it has to do with the robustness of the system, if the appropriate laws are in place, and it also has to do with the effectiveness of the system, if the real laws are implemented. I mean, this is something it's a body to which Nigeria voluntarily committed, because it's important to be part of this body. It's important to have, let's say, the standards that all the communities in the world have established, because it's going to improve the economic prospects of Nigeria, in the sense that it's going to be easier to receive investments, and it's going to be easier for financial institutions, for instance, to operate within and abroad the country. Now, what's the agenda? How can we solve this problem? Well, there are a number of factors that you briefly mentioned when you were asking me the previous questions. What's the real problem? What is the government failing to do? And the reason why Nigeria was grade-listed, and there is problem with financial flows. Basically, what has been found and what Nigeria is working to implement now is improving the assessment and updating the national framework and strategy to counter money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Also, a very important recommendation from the FATF that it's really relevant for illicit trade. It's increasing the dissemination of financial intelligence by the financial intelligence units and use it for law enforcement and vice versa, meaning that if there is an investigation on illicit trade, it's important to try to get the big fish, the criminal structure that is behind this egregious form of criminality. That are, I mean, you can mention them. It goes from illicit trade related to organized crime, human trafficking. I mean, the worst things that we have ever seen in terms of criminality. And then another point that Nigeria needs to address, together with the FATF, is that demonstrates a sustained increase in the investigation and prosecution of this kind of crimes. I mean, these are the things that the country, in a nutshell, needs to improve to get out of this situation, and certainly it's going to help to curb illicit trade and, again, improving the economic prospects of Nigeria.
Now, you have talked about various ways by which this can be combated, and you've also mentioned the fact that there is a need for commitment on the part of government. Now, a new administration is in place. It's just over 2 weeks now, and we've seen a few changes based on different steps being taken to reorder the economy. Now, looking to the crystal ball, what are you forecasting? What do you think would mean? What do you think this will mean for the new administration? Do you think it is committed enough to deal with this atrocious act, or do you think that probably might just be a cosmetic approach?
What do I think is going to happen? I think that that's your question.
Yes.
Yes, well, it's difficult to know now. I mean, we are really grateful that we are here again. Last week we were talking about South Africa. We haven't deployed any activity in Nigeria right now. We have some studies and some information that I just convey with you. We see that the country is growing. We see that it's a leader in Africa, Nigeria, without doubts. We expect to keep on working with the government. I need to improve the connections with the country and to try to disseminate this kind of information. This is ultimately our objective. Now, if you ask me exactly what's going to happen with the country and the prospects, I'm afraid I couldn't tell at this stage, but hopefully this is going to sparkle a little bit of action from all relevant stakeholders. For our companies, of course, this is a priority because it's a very important country, and it's a priority, of course, for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have issued a report with the UNCTAD, with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that showcases how illicit trade undermines all these goals of the nations. So what do we see? What's going to happen? It's on us. And this is why we are doing our most to try to change the way this problematic is drifting. It's becoming worse everywhere in the world, not only in Africa, not only in Nigeria. Now we are talking about Nigeria. And this is the problems that we see. This is the recommendations that we put forward, the one that I was just mentioning, that they are very similar to the ones of the Financial Action Task Force. We are here to assist. So yeah, we are visualizing this problem now. We hope the best, and we are going to be ready to try to make the effort together with the country and the different stakeholders in the country.
All right, thank you so much, Esteban. We know that Nigeria is the giant of Africa, and situations like this will continue to have a attendant effect on different African countries and, of course, the continent. And we hope that this kind of conversations will be scaled up so that we can address the challenges and put it to bed. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, we are deeply grateful. Have a nice day.
And you too.